Good afternoon. Welcome to those of us who are joining us virtually and those who are here. Stefan, it's really nice to see you. Welcome to the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair. We're going to talk this afternoon about your latest book, Ground Zero, which looks at the impact of 9/11 on the world and the world that we live in today and the world that we will live in moving forward. But before we begin, I thought if it's okay, if you could just tell us a little bit about your own biographical interest in the region, in the question of 9/11. Give us a little bit of a sense of what drew you to this subject.
Yeah. Hello from my part. Thank you for this invitation to the Goethe Institute, to Abu Dhabi Book Fair, and thanks Bilal for hosting this session. Well, it's a good question. My interest in the Arab world started when I was quite young. I love to learn foreign languages as a way to escape from the rather narrow-minded German atmosphere of the 80s. And I started to learn some Arabic and other languages, and quite early I went to Morocco and North Africa, traveled around and fell in love with the region. And then I started to study Arabic and literature, and I became friends with a lot of Iraqi poets, refugees in fact, who came to Germany after having fled from the pure persecution by Saddam Hussein and from subscription into the Iraq-Iran war. And we became friends and started to translate Arabic poetry. And that was in the beginning of the 90s, and we discovered that there's virtually none contemporary Arabic poetry translated into German. And we tried to change this quite successfully. And so I got involved with literary translation, literary criticism, essay writing, travel writing. And then and it was a good time, in fact. It was a good time. People were open-minded. We had a lot of possibilities to publish. Readers were curious. We made festivals and everything. And then 9/11 came, and that changed everything in the sense that now the discussion was refocused to the question of Islam. It was not anymore about cultural dialogue or getting known literatures from other languages. It was now all about Islam, and that also changed, well, I would not like to say my interest, as I'm still interested in literature, but it changed the expectation towards me and my friends as to what to say, because we were demanded to explain Islam, not just Arabic literature. And I was reluctant in the beginning, but then I embarked on this project and tried to bring forward a progressive view, a view which tries to convey the perspective of Arabs and Muslims. And I did so I was invited to direct a journal for the Goethe Institute, for the German Cultural Institute, which was meant to foster the dialogue between the Arab world and Germany, and we also started to publish it in English and Farsi. And so I might say that 9/11 really changed the direction of my work. I was not particularly interested in Islam before. I was more interested in contemporary culture. And then I had to really restudy Islam and try to gain a new perspective. And that was also quite interesting. But now I think 20 years after 9/11, this period has somehow ended, you know? It's also the corona crisis which contributed to this. So many things have changed that I decided to try to sum up that period, the last 20 years, and to see what has become of our world, what lessons we can draw from this experience, and what we should change, what we should improve. That's the meaning of the book in the end.
Well, I want to go back to this idea of the world that you were in before 9/11 and the way your own work changed. But let's talk about the world that existed on September 10th, 2001. Because what I remember, and it's I think you're dealing with this in your book as well, we're looking at a moment that was at the beginning of the millennium. There was a kind of optimism in the 90s about globalization, the world, connection, multiculturalism even. So can you just talk a little bit about not only the violence of that day, but the rupture from the world that was right before. Because I think the 90s, and I say this as an American growing up in that period, it was a time of, the biggest anxiety people had was whether their computer was going to stop working on New Year's Eve 2000. So I mean, tell me a little bit about the world that we were in right before.
Yes, that was a quite optimistic and open-minded time, the 90s. Of course, with the end of the Cold War and the East-West confrontation, people started to get more interested in the rest of the world, and me and my friends, we profited from this open-mindedness after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And although there were elements of racism against immigrants, especially Muslim immigrants or especially Turkish immigrants in Germany, there were debates about the veil and how acceptable Islam is or Islamic fundamentalism is. Still, people were very interested in getting to know more of the world. And this was also true economically because of with the East Europe started to open up, and there was a lot of investment in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europeans for themselves discovered the world, and there was optimism everywhere. We got rid of this great fear. I can remember nightmares of it when I was a child and a youngster, nightmares of the nuclear apocalypse, of nuclear war. Of course, all this changed and ended. So we were in an optimistic state of mind. Although looking back from now at this period, we rediscover how many bad directions were taken, how many bad decisions were taken at that time. If you look, for example, at as far as the neoliberalization of the world economy is concerned, I think this did a lot of harm, a harm which we only recognize now, I think. It was the World Treaty Organization which was founded or really set into motion at that time. The liberalization of the economies worldwide, the worldwide connection of economies, and also the internet revolution, which were greeted as a new beginning, as a democratization in the beginning. And now we see it has turned into the opposite. The internet has become a danger to democracy instead of being, a help or something which brings about democracy. And so we see the changes. So nearly everything which was positive in the 90s has now turned into some kind of a nightmare or of kind of a hangover, I would like to say.
Well, so after 2001, obviously with America being at the center of the attacks, and then of course President Bush, who was in power at the time in the US, the rhetoric of the clash of civilizations became the central defining idea, and of course it informed policymaking out of Washington, the wars that followed. Talk to me a little bit about the clash of civilizations as a concept, because what you described was an interest in the region, traveling, getting to be engaged with the culture, the literature, the history, the people. But I think the terms that were set after 2001 were very much one of collision. And that collision course period, talk me through how you thought about that in this book, writing it in 2021. What was the outcome of that, and how do you look at it now in hindsight?
Yeah, that's very interesting. In the 90s, there were principally two concepts, at least in the West, or two visions of how the world of the future would develop. One of them was the idea of Huntington and the clash of civilizations. That means that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the communist regimes, you would have several blocks divided along cultural borders. One of the cultural borders was, of course, the border between the West and Islam. Others were like China or Eastern Europe, but still, West and Islam was one of the main borders in that clash of civilization idea. On the other hand, you had the more positive vision of Francis Fukuyama, who talked about the end of history, meaning that after the fall of the wall, we won't have any ideological struggles anymore, because it was quite clear that the whole world development tended towards some kind of Western liberalism, more or less. And so that meant that all cultures and all people on the long run would become the same, even if it might take 100 years or more, but still. So that was the optimistic vision, which I kind of shared. And, but then with 9/11, the attacks of 9/11 were, of course, you could call them an illustration of the thesis of Samuel Huntington of the clash of civilizations. So what happened was now not the end of history. On the contrary, history began anew with 9/11. Something new happened, something unexpected happened. But the result was the clash of civilization. I think this was, unfortunately, also the vision or the idea which took hold in the minds of the responsible politicians and other decision makers at that epoch, leading to the idea, but still Fukuyama was in the background, because what did the US try? They tried to get rid of bin Laden and the Taliban in Afghanistan, and then they invaded Iraq. And what they tried was, what they officially said was to make the world secure for democracy, to make the world safe for democracy. But it was more, I guess, at least in Iraq, they tried to democratize Iraq, or if you might say, to westernize Iraq, to turn Iraq into a liberal democracy in the Western style. At least that was their hope, I think. And by turning Iraq into a liberal democracy, other nations in the region would follow. I think this was the vision. Of course, this did not happen, because the neighbors in the region, all of them were quite interested in not letting this happen. You know, they did not want the democratic experiment in Iraq to be successful, because if that had been successful, all the other countries in the region there would have been a strong pressure to democratize also. That would be true for Iran, it would be true for Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, it would be true for Syria and other countries. So each of them tried to get involved and to put their own militias and to disrupt the process. And this is what happened, and this is why this experiment was not successful. I remember well, all my Iraqi friends, they were so happy. I was reluctant to be in favor of the invasion of Iraq, but all my Iraqi friends were happy, because they were in exile because of Saddam Hussein. And the idea that they could get rid of Saddam Hussein, for them, was positive, you know. But what happened then, of course, turned the whole experiment into a nightmare. And just a couple of days ago, I talked to the same Iraqi friends, and some of them were, I would not say longing for Saddam Hussein, but were kind of idealizing him and saying, well, it was not this bad under his regime. So you see how bad the events have turned, that people can say something like this now.
Well, you know, the other thing too is I think it seems that we've moved on and it's impossible to now talk about the Islamic world. I mean, in a way, we're talking about countries, interests, politics, histories that are very different and clashing with each other within what used to be called in the West, after 9/11, the Islamic world. You know, the discourse of Islam in the West, like what exactly did that even mean? And I feel like looking back at it now, you know, you've just described within Iraq there were so many factions and interests about how that country's future should be mapped. And so this language of Islam, did you feel like it's now finally, I don't know, we've moved on from using that kind of block language?
In many ways, yes. But I think this is exactly the split. You have those who still tend to talk about the Islamic world, the Muslims as such, to talk about some essentialist conception of Islam, and you find those people in what, well, you could call the region where you have a strong Muslim presence. you might find Salafist or Wahhabist or even Muslim Brothers or others who talk about this essentialist or essentialized idea of Islam, and you have them in the West. And they're usually, let's say, conservatives or nationalist forces which are against immigrants and so on. All those who are against the mixing of the people, who try to establish clear front lines between people, to make a distinction between migrants and so-called originals. All those in the West have an interest to still keep on talking about the Islamic world as such, and the Islam as one block, and not to differentiate between very different people, states, notions of identity, and so on. But of course you have the post-colonial discourse, of which my book and my thinking is trying to be a part, where you try to deconstruct these notions and try to develop new ideas of how to address problems, which of course exist.
Well, you know, one of the things that's really struck me about your work is that after 9/11, there was a lot of writing from the West, journalistic, political, academic, about the problems of the so-called Islamic world. You know, many journalists set out to understand what was happening with the conditions of women, conditions of minorities, economic issues. I think one of the things, and you know, of course your book is published in German, but your essays that you've written in English as well about the book, you're really often writing a lot about what happened in the West as a result of 9/11. Your work seems to me kind of self-reflective on not looking out at the, you know, the Middle East and how it changed, or Afghanistan and how it changed after 9/11, but how actually the attacks came back to really shift the idea and the societies within the so-called Western world. So talk to me a little bit about that, and both, I mean, that's obviously something personally that you've observed, but tell me how it began to play out in the 2000s after 9/11.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, because I think it's very difficult. If you have some kind of those cultural conflicts, be they constructed or be they real, what happens? The stronger part always tries to put the focus on the other, especially on the faults of the other. So after 9/11, you talked about all the problems in the Muslim world. Of course, there were a lot of problems, but to switch the focus onto the other, of course, frees yourself from discussing your own problems, or tries to distract from your own problems, instead of talking about the problems which exist in Germany, be it between migrants or between parts of the population which have for some generations come to Germany, like the Turkish Germans. Most of them would have come to Germany in the 60s or even 50s or 70s, and now they have the second or third generation, but they're still not fully accepted as Germans. So let's talk about these problems. Let's also talk about our own conception of identity, of who we are, because when you always say, well, the others, they have so many problems, but we are kind of we are coming close to becoming a very good, close to become the ideal society, a real democracy, a real state of law and anything. Well, I would say, well, this is an idealized and unrealistic version of ourselves. If we see what we do, for example, in foreign politics, to whom do we sell weapons? With whom do we do business? From which global situation do we profit, for example, from low wages somewhere else? Then we immediately discover that our wealth and our prosperity and our idealized or ideal society depends very much on those problems in the other part of the world. So what we do is we export our problems and we import the benefits. And so it's really also an essay of self-critique. If we criticize the other, we always have to see how we ourselves participate in the problems of the other, or maybe even responsible for their problems.
One of the big threads, I think, not only in Europe but also in the United States now, is that since 2001, it seems that identity and questions of race and belonging and who's American, who's German, who's British, and a lot of it revolving around immigrants from, global South countries who are living in those countries. Those have become very central political problems domestically. We're not even talking internationally. These are very much the defining features of domestic political conflict. Do you see the roots of those identity issues in 9/11?
In part. I think the root of these identity issues is they are deeper. They're much deeper, and in the end, they go back to the age of colonialism and the economic globalization, which happened starting from the 18th century, culminating in the high imperialism of the 19th century and being developed in the 20th century. So these are questions of globalization, of imperialism, and of colonialism, and of the whole hierarchy and hegemony which was introduced into world politics by colonialism and by imperialism. And we have never really discussed those issues. Of course, we had the independence movements. We had a person like Gandhi. We had many struggles against imperialism during the Cold War, Soviet Union posing as being anti-imperialist, but in fact they were as imperialist as the United States. But these were different contexts. Now, after 9/11, and I think 9/11 has a part in that, after 9/11, we're discussing about all those issues of race and identity in a whole different manner, because in the end, also 9/11 was a late effect, or has something to do with imperialism, or the backlash to imperialism. So it set into motion a whole different perspective in which all those who formerly tried to integrate themselves, to be a part of this great big visionary West, they felt that they are not accepted because they are regarded as Muslim, as black, as other, as I don't know what. And this has shifted the focus, so they claim their rights with their own identity without trying to insert themselves in a vision of the West, a vision which was essentially always colonial, imperial, and hegemonic.
One of the things so in terms of self-determination and the right to be freed, and you're saying some read, the actions of 9/11, of the attackers themselves as having a kind of philosophy that they were going to act out against the new imperialists who had bludgeoned and limited their life prospects. Do you think you write a lot about 2011 and the revolutions that occurred starting in Tunisia and then Egypt, the Arab Spring as it was called, as something very much also rooted in and a byproduct of that jostling and that struggle for self-determination that began in 2001. Tell me about the link that you see between the revolutions of 2011, which largely were not very successful. In some ways, there have been a lot of problems that have proceeded as a result of that. But the way you saw a link with 9/11.
The Arab revolutions, I think, are not a direct result of 9/11, but they are an indirect result, and they are closely connected to 9/11. Of course, 9/11 set into motion a whole series of developments which eventually led to the Arab revolutions. One of those steps was, we already mentioned it, the invasion of Iraq and the idea to democratize Iraq. That of course failed, but it caused a lot of frustration, not only in Iraq, I think for many other peoples. Also it made stronger the failure of the US and the Iraq, made the political Islamic discourse stronger, because it seemed as if political Islam defended Iraq against Western intrusion. So it became, it could enhance its image as a liberation ideology against the West. That was important in the Arab revolutions when the Muslim brothers won the elections in Egypt, when they were very strong in Tunisia, when they, with the help of Wahhabis and what a lot of Gulf money, became a military force in the Syrian civil war and are still active in Libya. This was a vision of the post 9/11 Middle East, which was not a westernized Middle East. And it, in a way, it has similarities to, of course, to what bin Laden wanted to do, because bin Laden wanted to provoke a conflict between the West and the so-called world of Islam. And in the Arab revolutions, this idea was taken up in a way by many actors, although I think the majority of people was not interested in having a politicized Islam, but were interested in having a decent life, a good governance, and well, an economy and a political system which respected traditions without turning them into a political or violent force. But this was nearly inevitable after the failure of the revolution in Egypt and in Syria, because the problem was that from the outside you might think, and that was the impression in the West in the beginning, that the Arab revolutionaries wanted something like to westernize their countries. But the closer you looked, you discovered, well, they don't want to have a liberal economy like in the West. Many of the forces were former socialists or communists. So they wanted a more state-controlled or funded society. They didn't want to import the economical or political system of the United States or of Germany or of Great Britain. They wanted their own system. And this was one of the reasons, I think, why they were not really helped by the West, because the West knew, well, these revolutionaries are not exactly what we want the Middle East to become. Okay, so they did not get help from the West, but the Muslims, the political Islam, which was also very present in the Arab revolutions, they get promoted by those regimes in the Middle East who didn't want democracy, and these are, of course, many of the Gulf states, Iran, and some other players.
You said something earlier about how the era that 9/11 sort of was, in a way, has ended now. Like, we're now living in, it'd be interesting to know when you think about that time period ending and when the new epoch began. Some would say it would be after coronavirus, but I would argue that it could even have started with the ascent of Donald Trump or Brexit, like new political earthquakes that happened that made huge impact in the world. But I want to know about your writing this book. When did this idea for going ahead and reflecting on 9/11 and its shadow, when did it start for you? When did you write this book? What sort of motivated you to sit down with this theme now?
Well, the reason why I started to write this book, or why I started to develop this idea, was that I thought, that was before the coronavirus, long before the coronavirus. I thought it was the time of ISIS and all those terrorist attacks in Paris and somewhere else. So there was a very bad, feeling, and terrorism was very present, and discussions about migration were very present after a lot of migrants, a lot of refugees came from Syria in 2015, 2016. But nobody talked about 9/11, and I thought you could not explain what's happening now without going back to 9/11. ISIS, or the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, is unthinkable without 9/11 because it is unthinkable without the American invasion into Iraq. And all the problems which followed are also unthinkable without going back. So we have to go back to reconsider what happened there and then to think anew. What went wrong? How could we have changed our perspective, or how we can change our perspective to improve the situation that what is happening now is not repeating itself. And another idea for me was to go back even into the 90s, especially into the year 2000, when Al Gore was very close to win the presidency of the United States. And if you look at that period and about the political program of Al Gore, you discover, of course, he had this agenda of addressing the climate crisis already 20 years ago, you know? And now with, my children are like now in the beginning of their 20s, and they were very active in the Fridays for Future movement. And so I thought, well, this is really strange. Now, 20 years after 9/11, you young people go back to the vision of somebody who nearly became the president of the United States in the end of the 90s, in 2000. But then everything has changed, and all this climate change, all this climate and environmental agenda got lost in that so-called fight against war on terror or whatsoever. And I thought, well, we have to go back to this other moment to try to find a way to get into this alternative path of history, you know? And then, of course, the coronavirus crisis came, and I think it hits into the same, or it fits into the same project, because it's also about environmental issues, it's also about social issues. So it's really a big hint or symbol for our need to change the direction of, well, history is too big a word, but of Western politics, at least. Let's say this.
I want to ask you about Germany in particular, because, you know, I mean, the US, of course, you know, was at the center of leading these invasions and being responsible for so much of the instability that followed in its reaction to the attacks. Germany, I mean, of course, famously chose not to be part of the Iraq War, has been seen largely, you know, including in the acceptance of all the refugees in 2015, as a largely progressive country in the international system. Tell me about how Germany has changed after 9/11 and how you see 9/11 as also being a very German experience in some way. Because I'd be curious, given that it's a very different country from the US, still, you know, within the West there are major differences as well. So I want to know, as a German writing about 9/11, what have you seen Germany, how have you seen Germany change since 2001?
Well, that's a good question. In many ways, Germany really is quite progressive, or has pursued a progressive politics. But this came, I think, a bit out of necessity, especially in the Merkel government, who was, Merkel in her beginnings was quite a conservative politician in 2005 when she started to get into power. But then she more and more adopted to new trends in environmentalism, in issues concerning refugee politics or immigration. And so she more and more adopted to the mainstream opinion of the Germans. So yes, Germany was a quite progressive country, but at the same time, being myself quite close to the front line, as I talked all the time about Islam and Arabic literature and had a lot of discussions and readings in public, I was very soon after 9/11, I was confronted with what has turned out to be a new right-wing movement, which has now become a big party, the third biggest party in the parliament for the time being. And I could follow this development quite closely, and they were starting with asking questions about migrants, about Islam, about the veil, and so on. And this became bigger and bigger, and they connected with other right-wing movements all over Europe. And then you had, out of a sudden, you might say, but it was not out of a sudden, you had terrorist attacks against migrants. You had a series of right-wing terrorist attacks over the period of 10 years by a terrorist group who were just at random attacking migrants, even policemen. So you had about, over 10 years, you had like 12 or 13 killings. Then you had the attacks of Breivik in, I think it was in Norwegia.
Yeah.
And he attacked, this was an attack on immigration, in fact. People don't know it. He killed many young people in a camp, but it was a camp mainly for migrant kids, you know. So this happened. Then you had other attacks, and only recently, in 2020, you had attacks against a synagogue, and you had attacks against a shisha bar, where a lot of people of Turkish and Kurdish origin were just having a party, you know. So this movement was very present and is still present, it's still very dangerous. And this connected to movements in France, which were of the same kind, in the UK, which led up to the Brexit, I think, and in the US, which led up to Trump. So Steve Bannon, for example, was also very important for the German right-wing movement. And for me, it was very important to fight against this political movement, and then to unveil the links this conservative ideology had with the mainstream ideology in Germany. To give you, just to close and to give you, or to close this topic and to give you such only the most prominent example. The head of the German, what we call Verfassungsschutz, it's like a internal secret service.
Your version of the CIA,
yes,
essentially.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. It's like the FBI and CIA for the internal security. He is now very close to. He's still a part of Merkel's party, but he's very close to this very right-wing party, and he was the head of this secret service at a time when it was his responsibility to pursue and to investigate into those right-wing movements, but he himself is very, very right-wing. So you had the enemy was within the system, you know, and for those who wanted to see it, they could see it, but people liked to play it down and not to say anything about it, and this is what I tried to change in my activities as a journalist.
And you said you were watching, as you were speaking to audiences over the last few years, you've seen a kind of uptick in this kind of attitude, this sort of xenophobia, racism rising in Germany, in your own work, in your own writing.
Yes, of course. As a result of the there was this famous German welcoming culture in 2015. That's true, when so many refugees came, but it has kind of changed into a hangover or some kind of nightmare. People not knowing how to deal with the refugees, how to accept them or not. And German society by now is really split. And this doesn't translate into big politics or into the parliament, because we did not have elections for 4 years. So the forthcoming elections will be very interesting in that respect. And there's a great danger that you have, I don't think that they will win by now in this forthcoming elections, but you will have in the future, you will have a split in Germany as you have it in France, in Great Britain and in the United States. A clear-cut split between let's call it very conservative to right-wing populist party system or political representatives, and a pretty much progressive movement. And this is a big issue now in Germany. Who will take power? Yes, who will win this struggle? I'm still optimistic for Germany, but the situation is dangerous. Yeah.
Well, you know, I mean, it seems to me like an incredibly ambitious thing to try to take on how, I mean, and greatly admirable to take on how a major event like September 11th made the world that we live in now. You know, I mean, that's what you've essentially tackled in this book, is you've looked at so many ways it manifests in the systems that we live in now. You know, it's kind of now, I mean, not now as much, we're going to talk about now in a minute, but, you know, everything from how we traveled to every citizen experienced the impact of that day, to the people who, of course, lost their countries, who became refugees as a result of the wars that followed. It really remade the world. So you've taken on this hugely ambitious, big subject, and in a way you're asking all of your readers to pay attention to the shadows that you know, history creates. But then, of course, 2020 turns out to be, and 2021 turns out to be, extremely historical in its own right. Some could say March 15th or whenever it was that, you know, coronavirus got declared like a global pandemic and airports were shut, could be like the new 9/11 date. I mean, it was, you know, whatever date that was, 3/15/20, when air travel stopped in the world. And now I think, you know, I'm thinking about this as an American, like, yes, it's the 20th anniversary of 9/11 in a couple of months, but people are thinking about a whole other reality that we're now living in. So, you know, have we entered a new era, and do you think it's becoming difficult to even remember the sort of shadows of 9/11?
Yes, it might become more and more difficult, and this is why it is more important to throw some light onto this issue, lest we not forget it, you know, because it has made our world, and it also has made our view and our attitude towards the corona crisis. I was just this morning I was writing about this. There are a lot of analogies in the way of how terrorism was tackled as a problem and the coronavirus was tackled. This you just mentioned, closing of borders and not flying anymore. Of course you think, well, that's rational, but is it really rational as a reaction to the coronavirus? Maybe it's only rational because we got so much used to it. If you study the coronavirus and the spread of the coronavirus more closely, of course, flying plays an important role, but not closing the borders, you know. Closing the borders, coronavirus doesn't stop at a border, even if you close it. If you're not an island, like maybe New Zealand, you can try to do it. But otherwise, in Europe, it's completely fantastic. And what happened in Europe is they closed every border, which created a huge problem, because for 20, 30 years, we got used to have a cross-border traffic every day, people work on the other side of the border and so on. But this border closing didn't help in any way. If you study the virus more closely, you find that it's, in a lot of ways, it's social problems, it's social economic problems where you have hotspots of coronavirus. So what you have to tackle is social or economical inequality. If people live in poor, unhealthy conditions, cramped into a small apartment, many people, then you have a high probability that the coronavirus will spread there. Whereas upper class people or middle class people, for them it's much more easy not to get affected by the virus. The same is true for other measures you take against the coronavirus. If you say, if you stop the schools, it will be okay for people who are well off, who can teach their people at home, or who have an infrastructure which helps the kids to get along. But for poor people who depend on sending their kids to school, it's much more difficult. So where's the connection to 9/11? I can tell you, after 9/11, everybody has concentrated on fighting terror, on the war on terror, on democratizing the world, on westernizing the world, and also to globalize and neoliberalize the world. And in this movement, you completely forgot about social equality, about global inequality, about economical development of underdeveloped segments of society or countries. And so the whole idea of solidarity got lost, you know, and this was, I think for me, it was a purposeful politics, you know, by fighting terror and by proclaiming this as the big issue for the next 20 years or for the last 20 years, this distracted us from developing solidarity in social, economical, and cultural ways. It contributed to separating people, and this is what we also tried to do in the Corona crisis. Just think of the word of social distancing. I think it's a very bad word. You can be in favor of distancing for health reasons, but to call it a social distancing is a bit of it's an unlucky or unhappy choice of words, I think.
Well, you know, I mean, looking at the case of a country like India, where social distancing is not feasible at all for people, for majority of people, and we've seen what a catastrophe COVID was for so many people there, that the idea of being able to go and isolate in your own individual home is really a true economic privilege only available to a certain sliver of the world's population. The other thing that I'm thinking about as we're talking about the relationship between the age of terrorism and coronavirus is the question of surveillance, because, you know, after 9/11, one of the big measures taken in the US, of course, was the Patriot Act, which then civil liberties activists and people interested in the questions of, like, well, you can track everyone's movement, you can track everyone's communications. We were going to, you know, and everybody knows who enters the United States since 9/11 that you are fingerprinted, you are eye scanned, things that have now become increasingly much more common everywhere. And I would argue that in the age of COVID, you know, we're all essentially giving biological samples at all moments, at all times, and you know, people are willingly doing it for the sake of security and safety, but security and safety was also the argument used after 9/11 to say that, you know, you have to give up these liberties in order to have the security that comes with being prevented from an attack. So you know, I also think that there's of course always a calculus that has to be made to protect collective, you know, security, but I do think that is another question I have still moving forward is, what does it look like now that we can have biological surveillance and tracing, you know, which is an extraordinary thing too, in a way. I don't know if that's something that you also see as connected.
Yeah, that's a very, very important question. For myself, I'm really at odds, or I don't know, I'm not sure about the forthcoming development. I'm not one of those who condemn all those measures because they are afraid that it will be misused. I think this development is not obvious. I would give, at least I would give the democratic governments some credit for not trying to misuse the new surveillance possibilities which have opened up through the coronavirus. But the danger is definitely there. And the danger is there when a democratic society might become more and more non-democratic, or if you have a political development which goes into more autocratic or turns into a more autocratic system, then all those means of surveillance can be used in a very dangerous way. Just remember, of course, I think this is not the problem in Europe for now, but it might change. But I think it can be a problem in many other countries. And it is definitely a problem, I think, in China, where you have already a very close surveillance. And if you look at, for example, at Israel, it might be a big problem for the Palestinians. They were already so well surveyed that Israel could tell of every Gazan citizen who owns a mobile phone where, at which moment he or she is. And when Israel wanted to bomb a building in Gaza, they could call up each and every individual in that building and warn them to get out of the building, not to get bombed. So the surveillance was already perfect. But maybe it was not exactly the case for the West Bank, or it was not the case for Arab citizens or citizens of Arab origin in Israel. And also we have an international, we have the problem of international surveillance. So we don't, you know, one of the results of 9/11 was the extra-legal, an increase of extra-legal killings, of drone killings. So we started, the US mainly started to have a drone war, you know, to kill people in Afghanistan or in Pakistan or even in Yemen, sometimes even American citizens without a legal justification, just because they are consisted or regarded as terrorists. So this international state terrorism, let's call it like this, can become more, can get additional information through all these new surveillance we are seeing now. If you look, for example, at Saudi Arabia and what they did in the Khashoggi case, or what is now happening to this blogger in Belarus. You remember this blogger who embarked on a plane in Athens a couple of days ago and wanted to fly to Lithuania. And he was of the White Russian, the Belarusian opposition, and the plane got through the Belarusian airspace and it was kidnapped by the Belarusian Air Force and forced to land in Minsk. So of course we don't know if this has anything to do with the coronavirus. I don't think so. But you have for example, the Americans have the right to be informed about all of the air traffic in Europe, especially if it's connected to the United States. So they have all my air traffic data, you know. So and this is very easy to have this also for the Saudis or the Israelis, and why not for the Belarusians or the Russians or whomsoever. So this is a big danger, and this can happen to anybody. This can happen to anybody. Maybe Turkey is going to do this with an opposition leader in Turkey, or Assad is doing this, or anybody can do it. And this is I think, the real danger, which might be ahead of us in a couple of years.
Well, you know, I mean, we started talking about the 90s and the kind of the promise of an open borders society, and I think, you know, in one way that I've been really amazed over the last couple of years, is the last year and a half, I suppose, is how easy it is to live in a closed bordered society again, you know, and how easy it is for countries to seal borders, to leave certain people out, to make lists of who is and isn't allowed in, the exact thing that I think proponents of globalization have been fighting toward: ideas, people, goods being able to be exchanged. The way that we live now, it's very easy to stop that movement for whatever reasons it may be. You know, I think I want to conclude with one question I've been thinking about. Is it's been a quite heavy discussion about the various ways in which 9/11, you know, we really didn't, not only were there so many tragedies that followed, but a lot of the lessons that could have been learned, you know, were not. And additionally, the things that could have been tackled in its absence: climate change, inequality, the kinds of things that you talked about, the real chronic, you know, issues that the world faces, were not. And then also, of course, the financial crisis of 2008 and all the economic upheaval that followed only contributed to that inequality that you talked about. I just want to ask you if there are, in the 20 years that you've been looking back at, are there any signs of anything that you find hopeful in the world that came after 9/11? Is there anything that sort of emerged from this period that you put your own hope in? You know, that maybe, I don't know, could be not a causal, but maybe even a corollary. I don't know, a correlation of some kind, but something that gives you some optimism about the next epoch that we're going to be in.
In fact, to be honest, I'm very optimistic, and I think if we count it all up, even after 9/11, the result is optimistic. You know, we have been. It was a period, retrospectively seen, of missed opportunities. We have just talked about Al Gore, so history could have become better. But in fact, the whole project set up by bin Laden and by the American reaction onto bin Laden, summarized by the war on terror to westernize and globalize the world according to a neoliberal agenda, if we look back at it, it has failed. They have failed, you know? They have not achieved what they wanted to achieve. But we have to be aware of that, and we have to be aware of the fact that it was good that they have failed to achieve that. And where precisely did they fail? Because very often we fall into the trap of the logics and of the paradigm and of the mentality which started in 9/11 and with the reaction onto 9/11. This is what happens with the corona crisis. We fell into the trap of border closings, of separating people and so on. But I think, so for the coronavirus, I'm really not sure how it will turn out. You're absolutely right. It was kind of shocking how fast the whole world or the whole movement can be closed and everybody can be separated. But the sheer fact that we are sitting here, that you are here from the States and I'm here from Germany, and that people see us all over the world, can see us all over the world, and that Abu Dhabi is hosting this event as a real event, which is, for which I want to congratulate the Abu Dhabi Book Fair that it does so, is a sign of resistance and a sign that we don't want to give up and that we want to continue to be in dialogue, to travel, to meet each other, and to see what we can do to improve the situation and to get closer and to develop knowledge of each other and solidarity. And I think this is happening here, and judging from my friends, my Arab friends who came to this book fair, from publishers and poets and writers and journalists from all over the world, not only the Arab world, judging from my friends at home who are longing to travel and who sometimes travel despite the circumstances, even if they are considered as an avant-garde, I'm really optimistic that we will manage to build a better world despite all these inhibitions. Yes, thank you.
Well, and it seems that given that literature was your first inspiration and kind of, you know, the love for the region that you developed, it seems appropriate that that's where we're having this conversation. So thank you so much. And Stefan Weidner, the book is Ground Zero, and thank you to the Abu Dhabi Book Fair for hosting us. Thank you.
Thank you, Bilal. Thank you.
Thank you.